Hello everyone, just recently we discussed the Genius Augusti for our traditional and religious history series. Today we talked a bit, the magnificent lottery extracted today this topic for us, how Augustus established and consolidated his authority, the Principatus, in a more sort of political, institutional sense, right? For different reasons, which are not surprising considering the sort of centrality of Augustus in Roman history. We really covered an impressive amount of topics concerning Augustus, at least compared to other channels, and especially the very themes that we touched on are a bit under-discussed. Nevertheless, we will be expanding soon the same attention towards other emperors, also through the form of biographies or looking at their military histories, and so on. Right, how Augustus affirmed his auctoritas is a topic that, again, you can't but discuss in a metaphysical sense. However, there are earthly events that mirror that as well. And so you can argue that the transformation of Octavian into Augustus marked this crucial transition we've seen, again, in the video about the Genius just recently, from chaotic civil wars to a stable imperial system that initiated in Roman, in Augustan propaganda in particular, the so-called Pax Romana, or in fact Pax Augusta, that naturally had a divine meaning. It was a deity in its sort of hypostatic derivation from the one, right? This period was an era of relative peace across the Roman world that did not care to be particularly peaceful towards other peoples, but towards their own kind, right? This is the point we're told is often sort of hypocritically criticized about the Pax Romana, that we think of course, a fourth estate post-traditional modern sense of peace as some sort of end to itself, whereas to the Romans, the Pax, a bit like the Germans with the Frede, and we've seen this institutionally continuing historically also in the Holy Roman Empire, etc., was considered as a peace in arms. First of all, because, of course, the Romans were God's chosen people, and as warriors were to spread their control over the word holding it, rather than simply imperating, as they would have said that, like Virgil, of course, left us sort of masterpiece lyrics to understand naturally the difference between the two terms, like regere and imperare, that we also discussed just recently in other contexts. Again, we will come back again on Romanity, because we have just begun to scratch the surface of the cornerstones of all this, and therefore the sooner sort of we establish the fundamentals for the channel, the better. It took several years, but that's our pace, as we cover a whole lot of other things that are in any case connected, because had you asked really Augustus, it could have not been otherwise, starting from him and from the Romans. Actually, the Augustan reign was marked by great campaigns of expansion. I mean, aside from the civil wars that were definitely internecine struggle between the Romans, that was understood to be sacrilegious to begin with in its causes, root causes. As we've seen, the Caesarian, Augustan theology rather than ideology or propaganda had explained how this mechanism had happened. But when the Roman people was put back together, of course, it would return to its main occupation. And we have the conquests of Cantabria, of Pannonia, of Germania, as a matter of fact, regardless of the deep setback that affected the Augustan reign with the Clades Variana. It's strange, but we've never really made so far a video nor about that, nor about later Germanicus campaigns, nor about probably the conquest of Germany with Tiberius, and the, if anything, this concept also of the Romanization of many Germanic peoples that lived within the empire at this point, not just in the sense that, of course, as we always say, Rome controlled actually also the peoples from the other side of the Rhine, albeit indirectly. We're talking of specific Germans, such as the Ubi, for example, that will, with Ara Ubiorum, later Colonia Agrippina, in fact, give rise to one of the most important cities in Europe, namely Cologne. There is much about the sort of aspect of Romanization. I think we should expand a bit more. I've seen in the poll that I published last year that you want to see after medieval history, essentially more ancient history. I'm working a little bit for this because I think towards ancient history is almost a sacred sort of attitude and direction. Remember, it's from years that I want, at least at this point, it's 3 years. We are entering the third year that I wanted to finally make a video. I wanted to make it since the very beginning, but I thought it was too much big guns about the genesis of the Manipular Legion. And the beauty of ancient history is that you can definitely derive from primary sources most of what you need for crafting, especially a political, institutional, historiographical narrative, right? As you know, I think that archaeology is a bit overrated in general in explaining these things, and people tend to veer away, not just because of the deterministic, materialistic bias, but because they also feel threatened by what essentially Rome represented. It's true that indeed the Pax Romana, the Pax Augusta, witnessed to a world largely free from major armed warfare within the empire. Right, it was a moment of great stability, of unprecedented wealth. Nobody had really, if you think about this, also from the Republican perspective, never really controlled in a unitary sense, because the Principatus was heading, of course, towards an increasingly monarchic direction. The entirety of the Roman world now expanded with the addition, say, of massive chunks like Gaul, or the final occupation of Egypt, that, as we've seen also in other videos, Augustus conferred very specific, institutional roles to, especially for the military way that province had to be administered directly through the imperial prefect, essentially, that responded just to Augustus. So you can find all these things scattered in the channel. There's an Augustan era playlist, as I was saying before. You can simply check that out, or in the top fixed comment down below, as usual. And so not even Alexander, after he took over Persia, actually controlled area. You can discuss at that time whether it is true compared to Augustus in relative terms, right, which is another story. And we could make a video about this, but in absolute terms, so nobody had ever controlled such a vast amount of territory, right? And we tend, also because the 19th century tended to tell a bit the history of Rome through lines and colors and on a map or whatever, how expansively reaching the Roman control really was. Right, we don't just have a Templum Augusta in Malabar, for example, but we know that the Romans traveled as far as China. This is obvious in general because of mergers, this is true also before. But I mean, the idea that a single man would be able to control this, essentially a properly now European and Mediterranean dimension, with the control on the main Levant, etc., is unprecedented. It will not be achieved anymore. Right. Also, when we covered the Crusades, for example, and we stressed the parallelism between ancient and medieval theology regarding the necessity of an imperial Catholic power to expand to that level of ecumenic scale, we don't tend to represent in pop culture historiographically the Crusades as the sort of simple tendency that routinely occurs, by the way, in Western history to try to expand, take control of Levant. Right, the Sea peoples had tried that and partially even succeeded back in the Bronze Age, or at the end of that, for that matter. Let's not even talk the steppe world that had routinely launched offensives deep into the Middle East and beyond. If you look at our Bronze Age warfare here, you realize how much, even just by vocabulary, right, the military one, especially, like the Indo-European influence had been that compact, right? But this would routinely come back, and the point being always the same, recompacting this world, and especially a world that was not at all homogeneous or uniform, or in a Roman sense tendentially sort of flattening, as some people believe, for some sort of strange statalistic or bureaucratic inclination, which is, if anything, something that mostly started in a proper sense only in the moment of the crisis in the later empire. And that was, even at that point, a mean to an end, as a matter of fact. Ask the Eastern Roman Empire, for that matter. But it's, in this sense, a a necessity to elevate the world itself to divinity, and therefore unavoidably, like in the Fasces, like recompacting through unity, which is not equality. It's essentially an organic hierarchy, right? A corporative doctrine where the worthy are elevated to heaven through the, however, also medium of the leaders, just like Augustus. That this was true for the Romans in general. Think about their own plebeians, were surely considered as a superior kind, ethnically, even racially, to I don't know, all these peoples that they had conquered for that matter, just because they served in arms, and the Cingulum Militaris was associated with the idea of nobility, right? Because whoever has that minimum of imperium that they can autonomously employ is part of this hierarchy and is stretching towards heaven. Many years ago, I made a video about the Roman eagle and its deeper symbolism, the idea that the Prinkaps during, and this is particularly the case for the funeral of Augustus himself, in the Decursio, the great knights of Rome would gallop around in this cyclical motion that reflected, as we've seen also in the video about Indo-European theology connected with the sound K, that is also the one for cosmos for that matter, the same, in fact, universal order. Their own would throw into the burning pyre their own decorations that they had earned in war under Augustus, through his own auspices, as he said in the Res Gestae, while a free eagle was liberated over the pyre, symbolizing the soul of the emperor that is able at that point, like the eagle, as was believed, the only bird, or the only being that can look at the sun, all right, without getting blinded, and so ascending to heaven, as will be for the Divus Augustus. Needless to say, we're, as I was saying at the beginning, consolidating a vast amount of content on specifically this. It may seem sometimes that we are, I can't say repetitive, because we're pretty varied in terms of core topic, but it's important to also familiarize the new subscribers at some point with the concept in and of itself, to sort of stress the importance of fundamental core meaning, symbolism, etc. So walking on the footsteps of Alexander, this is what Octavian really was about, right? This is what actually Caesar, famously enough, had been about, complaining that at his age, far beyond sort of the one when Alexander died, he had not really accomplished, a fraction of what he had done, and actually ending up achieving something really important, like in the Augustan theology that is also connected with the Fortuna Caesaris, that was, as you know, a religion that Caesar in his lifetime had incarnated, had fixed the res publica, and so had handed over to Octavian, and through also the adoption and the divine blessing of the empire and victory over Antony at sort of the fractal element of the whole system. The sort of the title of Augustus of he woke from augere, which means properly to elevate oneself through that divine direction. And famously enough, when Augustus when Octavian at that point had marched into Egypt after the defeat of his rivals at Actium, he visited the tombs of the Diadochi, but obviously of Alexander himself in Alexandria of Egypt. And he really believed, he stated in front of his retinue that Alexander was alive, and that when asked to look at the other Diadochi, I don't know, say the tomb of Ptolemy, he said, "No, have not come here to visit somebody who died, who was immortal, as a matter of fact." So that tells you just the mentality. Sometimes you have to read a bit through the lines, because I would say Roman history is overly popularized to an extent, at least, except it's the more trivial, sometimes more secular, the more modern one, and it's mostly about warfare and technology and whatever. But if you really look slightly more deeply, and it doesn't take really just to have an overwhelming education for knowing these things, and to reading through the lines of their own history, right? Not even our own, because you should, when you read sort of Latin literature, you should shut up and listen. very carefully, by the way, you really understand what mattered to them, right? And it requires a great spiritual work from your side to properly appreciate what this was all about. Born Gaius Octavius on September the 23rd, 63 BC, into an equestrian branch of the plebeian gens Octavia, Octavian, we can call him, let's call him Augustus for the sake of simplicity here, became the founder of the Roman Empire, at least in the way we also understand it. It's actually a misnomer, right? The Roman Empire already existed, and it was not established at a point, because the imperium, first of all, the Romans mostly called their own polity among the sort of most perfect titlings as res publica populi Romani. And within this Romanitas, very interesting things happen, including the imperium, and especially the connection that the Romans, in particular, because that was an imperium that historically many other peoples had held, also in the Roman view, were to, in fact, extend to the entire world in a sort of broader prophetic, providential vision of the world that is too big for us to, or even properly too hard to even begin to appreciate in its fullness, of course, that brought that imperium to be held by the leaders, by those who could lead the chosen people by God at that point, if victorious in arms. The Romans had understood, as always, that it was their point to conquer the world. Augustus is understood as an emperor because we sort of see how bad that is. We institutionalized Roman history. We started to talk these titles as offices, as labels, right? So definitely Augustus was not the first emperor, right? There were many imperatores historically, would have never been considered like this. Prinkaps would be a better title that we also analyzed. In fact, in the video about the Genius Augustan, that was not even actually a video about that per se. We understand, however, that some of specific magistracies possessed by him, including also a broader sense of that it was an imperator as a medium of the divinity, and so in any case bestowing imperium himself, right, with the Roman army, the Roman people like acting on behalf of him, occurs, as you know, from 27 BC until his death on August the 19th of 14 AD. That is a fairly long reign, especially considering what the guy had gone through. He died at 75. Ideally and theologically, like, his imperium stretched further, because it's understood, and still you can find this in the sort of the scripts about Frederick II of Hohenstaufen in the heart of the Middle Ages. The Romanity of the Empire had been metaphysicized, right? And that's the reason why the Frankish emperors, the Ottonian emperors, at some point declared specifically to be Roman from an ethnic point of view, because it was understood that what the Romans had achieved was this super achievement. Then that sense was also mixed in with Christianity, given that under Augustus' reign Christ was born, as a matter of fact. But this was understood properly as a metaphysical and biological race at the same time. It's a bit like the concept of, say, this imperium that is omnipowerful, as much as Caesar is father of Octavian, even though not in a conventionally biological sense. But at that point, you should also debate the Immaculate Conception. And contrarily to the sort of famous, or at least the, again, modern explanation, etc., tradition contemplated quite deeply and quite renowned and quite explicitly, by the way, the concept of not necessarily an immaculate conception, but the idea that God was inherently the father of his own mother, right? Not just his human son, as a matter of fact. So don't think that the certain dogmas of the Catholic Church are merely peregrine or were made up at some point in history. This was part of a massive Catholic tradition that existed millennia before Christianity itself. And I always urge people to really understand what I'm talking about and to watch my videos about Christianity, as a matter of fact, as much as these other ones about, of course, like what I will not use the term pagan because it's so vile and low that I refuse myself to even prefer it. to attribute it in this case. But the point I was making is that, as we've seen also in the videos about the doctrine of the afterlife, is that Augustus would have ideally then always led any other emperor, right, as God himself. And in this sense, any other emperor would have ever come was essentially receiving these auspices from the heavenly soul, the transcendent emperor, that in that case, the heavenly achievement always interferes with the world. That's also the prerogative of those who made it into heaven through self-sacrifice in holy war, right? Or in this simple transcendence achieved through the will of the imperium. As you know, Augustus was not much of a military man in a strict sense, but this was not important. It was believed coherently with the theology of the era that the mere providence of the man, like a vision, like the eye of Ra, basically. It's not a surprise, obviously, that Augustus, but it was not the only one. He would be represented as a pharaoh in Egypt, whereas in Rome, he would have rejected even somebody kneeling, right? Or because the Romans were the packed and courageous bunch that kept the divine standard high, especially in this golden age that was sung by Virgil and had been prophesied at some point springing out between the bronze and the iron one. And that can be seen, in fact, at this point as the peak of historical power, as its descendants, for which Christianity comes not as a cause of decline, but as a consequence of decline, to fix it. But here we're also looking at other things today. We don't talk about Christianity. There is also, and we never really talked much about the Flavian era. I have some videos about it. We talk about Domitian. We talk about the same sort of initial, mostly Domitian, telling the truth. We talk about the Jewish wars. We talked about Titus, Vespasian here and there, but say we still have really to address them. But more importantly, it's notorious that from a historiographical point of view, there was a very heavy essentially a dark legend fabricated against the Julio-Claudians that also pass a little bit, not just as the most famous and remembered emperors for a reason, by the way, but also somehow the more grotesque, or the monsters, like, think about Caligula's alleged madness, or Nero's monstrosity. These were actually, the Julio-Claudians were all great emperors in their own regard, and sure, like, it's not like they were all perfectly aligned in, like, no person actually is. Augustus had embodied properly the absolute balance, right? There was all a specific astrology behind him. So not just that he was a Libra, but he had been conceived just after the solstice as a new beginning, and in the phase of Januarius. There are similar parallelisms even with the same Sol Invictus symbology of Frederick II. By the way, never think, I stress it every time, we still have to make a video about that, but the Sol Invictus was an Eastern Oriental thing that the Romans, the Italics, even had it since archaic times. It is not really discussed. So we're going to skip gossip about Augustus because sort of shortcomings in an earthly empire occur, but the persistent rumors, in fact likely unfounded, claiming his wife Livia poisoned him, are completely to be rejected. There are also the ones that ideally would like to think that she suppressed him while he was already dying, basically to prevent him from suffering further. But that's also just like the pinch of, of negativity that in any case the Flavian era wanted to clothe the Julio-Claudian one with, because imagine the Flavians, it was a bit complicated to be at the head of the Roman Empire after the Augustan period. Now, Augustus's reign established, as we've seen again in the video about the Genius, the Principate. This is notorious. The things you learn in primary school. That is a form of government where the emperor essentially maintained nominal deference to the Senate while holding supreme authority. It was not even so simple, right? Nobody held an absolute authority. It was mostly understood better, again, in that metaphysical sense of the Prinkaps as a medium, as a head of state, earthly speaking, but like operating in a dimension of his own between God and men, as a matter of fact. I also made a video about I remember how he titled it, but it was like a couple of months ago, where we explained how the Romans gave the concept of state that was not quite used at the time, but intended as that regime, given the term regere that we explained before. That is to say, to hold the world, not to oppress it, as a matter of fact, to elevate it to divine standards, in a truly incarnated sense, whereas the Greeks had already abstracted the idea of divinity because they had been so much in love with it, they had lost themselves into it, and sort of seeing even the Roman conquest as some sort of accident had not really scratched their perfect Hellenic world. And so Romanity is a real saga of incarnated divine power, and the entire Roman tradition, mythology, history, and literature must be read exclusively through this lens. The Principate, as we conceive it, is a system that endured until the crisis of the 3rd century, and that in a sense also lived further because, as just explained, in a monarchic, imperial sense, in any case, founded the entire sense of Romanity as the only possible power that can manifest in the world from Augustus onward. And that, for example, for medieval Christians absolutely believed still. Octavian's ascent to supremacy truly accelerated after his crushing victory at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Perhaps this year I'm going to make a video about the times and meaning. Perhaps from a novel series we'll make an actual video about proper reconstruction through primary sources of the Battle of Actium against Mark Antony and Cleopatra, although Octavian's standing in constitutional terms had remained up to that point relatively murky, because this is exactly the genius of Octavian. Not just his enormous courage, his ability to risk everything, maintaining control in an incredibly hostile political and military environment, and skillfully navigating, as successful navigating himself out to victory through that, but the creation of this great system. And Caesar had founded the theological premises of regality, essentially restored on earth. Augustus basically limits himself to collect the order and to fully stabilize it, right? Because he could not put himself at the same level of Caesar, right? Okay, he was eventually to be called Caesar also because he had been legally adopted, and in this sense elevated, right? What Octavian does is beyond even what Caesar had envisaged, at least if we stick to a sort of superficial earthly interpretation. But it's only the obvious consequence of what his father had achieved. After Actium, the empire was truly his, yet he wielded substantial real control without any matching official position or lawful authorization to support it. The Romans ruled themselves through this set of magistracies shared by the senatorial establishment that was essentially this rotatory, cyclic, and in this sense gluingly cohesive mechanism that had to mirror once the power that Romulus had achieved, right? The prerogative of kings, including the one of Pontifex Maximus, stood at some point in that same magistracy that was covered by different people. We have seen how the same Caesar had covered very young the office of Flamen Dialis, was very much connected with Jupiter himself. So the entire institutional mechanism would become the same set of tools that would allow Augustus to affirm himself as such. Right from the start, he selected imperator as his praenomen. Right, so he stabilizes, fixed, as we were saying before, properly the concept of like, I am the imperator. You know that the Romans do not have articles, right? But he, by assuming the title in this immovable way, he entailed, of course, that his imperium was superior and all-encompassing, right? The imperium comes from the Proto-Indo-European root pair that means to strike, to trust. This is the actual meaning of the empire. And so we understand how bloody and physical, even in the warlike Roman mentality, really was. It's like Octavian at that point to become Augustus's trusting into Egypt as the symbol, probably of the feminine, chthonic, telluric world of this enormous womb that is penetrated by the northern conqueror to establish a full divinity, as we've seen in the deeper meanings of Indo-European theology, flying right on the waves, right, as the migratory swan. So you see beautifully represented also in the Arapakis as the birds, the migratory birds coming from properly the world beyond, right? Hence also the same, Arthurian legions with the law and green world, the symbolism of this one. It is present everywhere since the European migrations. In Europe, we will keep making videos about that symbolism. And Imperator, in that sense, was probably the commander. Also, he who simply wielded the imperium by giving orders, by sort of disposing through his sheer metaphysical power, a numinous force. The acquisition of Imperator as praenomen was an intentional move from Augustus that naturally discreetly highlighted for everyone matching that military imperium, serving as the genuine foundation of his influence as supreme commander and the holder of the military authority. We'll see now especially the word auctoritas that is crucial in Romanity and will remain at basis, for example, also medieval law. Now, the legions' obedience and Augustus's command over them provided sheer coercive power. This is a complex mechanism of clienteles that, anyone familiar with the Civil War is able to explain in detail. We still haven't made really a video about, mutina or how the lists of conscription, the same second triumvirate, etc. The power, that the fidelity of the legions per se was conceived, however, still as a sort of chthonic dimension. Yes, this was the Roman military, right? But it was the substance, right? Now Octavian needed a form, right? It didn't matter how many legionnaires were under his authority and at his orders. There had to be a legitimate constitutional entitlement that would absolutize the divinity, the de facto divinity of his power, even if indirectly and explicitly. We've seen it also in Caesar. This was understood in a deep providential sense, probably by the idea of Roman power, that the imperator is essentially a great numen that manifests in human form, like a deity, really. It doesn't need to have this immense, oriental fast, right? The sort of Octavian's propaganda against Antony, for example, was very much leaning toward that direction, even though Antony was really a Caesarian, whereas Octavian had already stepped beyond. And also Cleopatra's figure is actually incredibly sort of fascinating for not for the gossiping reasons that were presented. The same Antony died through Rome, and there wasn't any sort of real Orientalism about. It was a great Hellenistic tradition of power that was surely adopted in some ways, also by Augustus, and we've seen in the iconography. The griffins, for example, were actually a step symbol, but had sort of developed in the Middle East through also the Alexandrian era, etc. The second triumvirate officially dissolved near the end of 33 BC after its 5-year prolongation had concluded. Nevertheless, the structure had effectively become hollow much earlier, following Lepidus's marginalization in 36 BC after opposing Octavian in Sicily. But Lepidus, as we'll see, was one of the few people of all this great scene, as also famously Augustus thought of his own life in the end, that actually died of natural causes. Lepidus has a sort of fairly easier life, at least, than all of these. Octavian acquired lifelong sacrosanctitas tribunicia, that is to say, the naturally tribunician inviolability that had been a prerogative of, again, the Roman balance, check and balance of power, right? The tribunes had historically affirmed themselves to balance out the forces between patricians and plebeians. The death of the so-called republic, it also is a term that never really existed, at least we can intend it as the res publica that eventually was fixed by Caesar. and perfected by Octavian in that metaphysical sense with killing of tribunes, right, that occurred in the Gracchian era. Obviously, we also made videos about that bloodshed, and that was deeply invalidating and undermining the entire Roman institutional architecture. Octavian acquired this lifelong sacrosanctitas during the ovation awarded for his victory over Sextus Pompeius at Naulochus in 36 BC. I made a video about that confrontation. If you're interested, we also surely covered that naval battle where Agrippa once again many occasions shown for our naval history series. Now, coming to the sacrosanctitas, this obviously comes from sacer, that is sacred, plus sanctus, holy, inviolable. And it comes from the Proto-European sanct, that is probably for sacred, and it, in this sense, entailed the idea that the power held by this tip of the balance of a magistrate was to hold the entire res publica, and therefore the lifelong capacity of Octavian in that role was already a pretty absolute ecumenic and divine project. In anticipation of the clash with Mark Antony, because this, as we've seen from the dates, happened way before Augustus, it so makes you understand how the title was eventually recognized just as a culmination of previous sort of institutional construction. In the anticipation of the clash with Mark Antony, that, as you know, dragged with alternate sort of moments of de facto truce or peace and with war, Octavian secured comprehensive oath of allegiance from the entirety of Italy. That was obviously the true bundle of power, ethnically, strategically, etc. In fact, in the entire empire, Antony was richer, but Octavian was stronger, right? This had been the point also during the first civil war between Caesar and Pompey. We'll come back also in the strategic balance of the same. This was the famous coniuratio totius Italiae, right? It's sort of interesting. Yesterday we were talking about the Longobards, rulers like Authari or Agilulf, that in the 7th century would call themselves like Gratia Dei, I'm now switching to ecclesiastic pronunciation, Regis or Rex, singular, Totius Italia, because at the time they wanted to stress the composite nature of Italy, if anything, because the Byzantines were still there. And it's very interesting that, after all, in the same century, like the one of 32 BC, where this occurred, still Italy had not been simply fully Roman, right? There had been the so-called social war that we briefly covered just for the sake of manual completion, but we have to come back to better at some point, that reflected aside from the specific legal issues to obtain the full civitas optimo iure, this historical certification, is historical information of Italy in a de facto national sense, especially at this point coming to completion under the relentless Roman conquest, right? And the final achievement at this point, at least under Augustus' reign, of the full world conquest by the side of these people that colonized, especially large swathes of the West, and sort of molding it in an ethno-linguistic way, right? Unlike any other people had previously done. Coniuratio comes from condes, together, plus jurare, to swear, from the Proto-European iu, to join, to bind, as a matter of fact, right? So this was definitely a legal and religious alliance that reinforced Octavian as Caesar's heir, as the leader of the Romano-Italic Confederacy, and now of a fully sort of Roman people as such. That also entailed, obviously, the fidelity of all the the Italians that were abroad, including like in Egypt, in Antony's legions, controlling the various populations. That was a very subtle way, in fact, to claim legitimacy in front of, for example, Antony, that was a Caesarian, and so, was considered surely by some of his men more than Octavian for different political reasons, but Octavian was objectively Caesar's son at that point, and heir, lawful heir, by the way, by St. Caesar testament. So in a broader metaphysical sense, the power was legitimately passing through him, and if the entire Italy had sworn an oath of allegiance to him, all the Italians in the legions that were roughly at this point, like essentially all the legionnaires, right? There were legionnaires already recruited elsewhere, so Caesar had refounded Carthage, for example, but these were still Italians, and so generationally speaking, I even made a video about the prevalence of the Italians in the legions up to the 2nd century, for that matter, and even with the provincials eventually being in a substantial part still descendants of Italians. Even properly directly, sort of in a lawfully recognized way, not just by the extension of the citizenship to an entire sort of province or group. So the meaning is very deep, right? An oath swearing of all of Italy that is irresistible, right? This happened properly to consolidate the western provinces, subsequently aligning themselves as documented in the Res Gestae, right? And this is very important historically, the fact that manpower laid in the West, that the East was naturally richer, by this point was historically more developed, but moral power laid in the West, manpower laid in the West. And the Romans kept showing that historically, and even after the fall, so the so-called fall of the Roman Empire, as we've seen in many medieval history videos, actually Romanity continues straight from there, other than just like in a broader Eastern sense that sort of blurred itself further. Now, this personal inviolability, because of the Tribunae Potestas, gained additional strengthening in 30 BC, via the incorporation of various tribunician rights. The jus auxilii, jus means law right? It comes from the same root word in Proto-Indo-European that we said for jurare, right? So it's the Roman legal mentality has always this double threaded meaning, such as the word munus, that is a duty, but also a privilege. Right, what binds it is a heavily contractual sense that is understood naturally with a divine, and so it's the jus auxilium means simply the right of aid to appeal, right? This was the authority to enroll people into the patriciate, right? That naturally came from patricius, from father, and so the holders of the mores, the bestowers of the auspicia, the capacity to forgive individuals sentenced in criminal cases, because they were essentially superior to them. It could dispose of them, could fix them, could the manumissio in Romanity, the libertas, the idea that there is an absolute realm of freedom, but it is only controllable by the divine and the divine holders, whereas the other kind has to be liberated from themselves, right? This is one of the most subtly effervescent and poignant and bloody and sanguine Roman theological and metaphysical concepts. Simultaneously, Octavian monopolized the consulship, right? Possibly from consultes to leap or related, annually from 31 BC all the way to 23, appointing devoted allies at 23 BC to serve as his rotating colleagues. He did not monopolize the magistracy for himself. In any case, it was collegial, by the way. And in spite of the outward form, this continued as a provisional solution that hardly concealed the core fact that Octavian's preeminence originated chiefly from military dominance, obtaining merely partial legal endorsement and having to do with the fact that, again, Caesar's legions were with him. he had won the war. He had controlled the Senate through that. So for quite some time. In any case, the Senate had lost control in the 50s already on the res publica as well. The so-called Roman warlords were, perhaps the idea of warlord has been a bit too much overstated, but definitely the idea that now that there were some specific leaders that controlled most of the system is actually correct. And Octavian brings it to the ultimate solution institutionally. In 28 BC, Octavian's appointment as Prinkaps Senatus conferred upon him acknowledged presence in Rome's foremost deliberative assembly. Prinkaps naturally stemming from Proto-European pair first, foremost, and cap to grasp, right? So it actually refers to the war band leader's primacy on the spoils of war that he has conquered, because it's through his mediation that imperium has also made the rest of the war band, that, as we've seen with the Coniuratio Italiae, is all one under him. Is again getting that force, that power, only through his own doings as a leader. It's extremely important, and especially associated with Senatus, because this makes him not merely the first of the Senate, as somebody could say, like a primus inter pares, simply. Not quite. This is a wrong concept, not just for the Romans, but also this is often said also for the Germans, as if there was some sort of egalitarian democracy out there. They were all equal, right? One thing is to be all strong because you're very strong and valuable, like Pyrrhus's ambassador Kines referred about the Roman Senate. It was a consensus of kings rather than of men, right? So of gods to a degree, and that those were the patricians, the patres familias of the entirety of Rome, and so the clan leaders, etc. So the fact that you're a princeps, and so the guy that basically directs the Senate and has the privilege of essentially getting things first, also for himself and for the res publica, is crucial. It's a very underrated term. We already explained the etymology in the video about the genius, but we're mostly talking about the genius in a more sort of spiritual sense. Here, politically speaking, remember what we said before about divine incarnation. The decisive shift, however, occurred soon after into important Senate gatherings on January 13th and 16th of 27 BC. With striking confidence, Octavian executed a meticulously staged performance by formally handing back his gathered powers to the Senate and the Roman people, an action rich in propagandistic significance, in a synchronized response presented as a shared gracious act, and so probably a grace of God, because he could afford just to restore this. The Senate swiftly ratified his prior privileges and conferred an extra 10-year proconsular imperium targeted at the border provinces, which contained the largest concentration of legions assigned to frontier protection. Right, the proconsulship had been historically a way to be controlling actually multiple provinces on behalf of the individual consuls that for different reasons could not even gain or could not be sort of simply multiplied, so they had created more of them, but eventually the term had come to acquire an overarching capacity of control. In fact, that here the Senate confers Octavian the control on those that will become, in fact, imperial legion. Remember, he's the imperator now for good, right? So, and I discussed this naturally in many videos, including probably about the difference between the senatorial and imperial legions, is the point that the imperator, they really controlled the system on the tip of the sword, that naturally is not sort of this, oh my God, there's a tyrant. No, like the decisive moral majority of the Roman people was with Octavian, and not because he had a gladius behind every senator. It's because the system was stable and worked like that. And had obviously like all this force could have been dispersed. No, they choose Octavian, right? And he reinforces this further. And obviously there were many practical material ways the Octavian has struggled to secure this control, not least sort of Caesar's quite conspicuous inheritance that as a good Roman, Octavian had to immediately reinvest to garner this loyalty. But there was something higher, something more spiritual in Romanity that had brought to that in the end of the civil wars, and so something grandiose and greater than a merely earthly achievement. The difference, as you know, between the senatorial and the imperial legions actually would eventually sanction the repartition of spheres of influence. Like the richer and, however, more easily controllable, so more pacified provinces of the, say, Mediterranean hinterland went, not all of them, but tendentially like places like Spain, say, went over to the senators that had this massive latifundia that they simply got what they needed from. Whereas the legion, say the imperial provinces were the more strategic ones, the ones garrisoned just for reasons of sort of imperial security in the broader oikumene, and that were more directly and centrally controlled by the monarch as such. And at some point we will explain sort of how materially this worked, because it is true that at this point, as we said at the beginning, there wasn't much of a Roman bureaucracy as we intended, or much of a Roman state in a broader administrative sense. And it is true that these legions really responded to some higher call, and that the Romans had, after all, taken over the world, otherwise inexplicably, from literally a city-state. This mechanism, however, was what allowed the imperial household to control the same sort of crucial provinces over which, like, the control of the entire empire rested. And that was a lesson learned from the age of the civil wars, where also the triumvirates and other pacts of sort of repartitions of sphere of influence had backfired, because at that point it was not really a balance that could be strategically decisive regarding who rolling role. And Octavian was the only one that achieved this now. This fresh authority officially positioned the greater portion of Rome's armed strength under Octavian's leadership, enhancing the regular consular privileges he already enjoyed, as we've seen, merely because, by the way, the Roman magistracies were variously provided with imperium, not all of them, but obviously the consulship had historically been the most imperium loaded, right? And so there was a further sanction of the direct faculty of command of the imperator for those provinces through the proconsular power, right? Which was a way essentially to act senatorially, and so as a sort of, not necessarily fiction, but sort of consensually lawful way to say it's the Senate that gave you this power. Like we recognize as the Roman people. Actually, the best of the Roman people as through also your leadership. Merely 3 days following that, amid the dedication of the Clupeus Aureus, a golden shield engraved with the leader's essential virtues, the Senate discussed a suitable honorific title matching the Prinkaps' exceptional auctoritas. Right? Let's see what this also means. The Clupeus has also to do in with probably the term of shield, the older term for shield, including the one used by Romulus and coming from heaven. It was the Ankylos as well, but let's say the meaning of this shield in a broader sense may have come from Cleo, which is the same root word, as you know, for to hear, to fame, right? In a, again, a very heroic sense, and obviously Aureus being divine as such, right? Now, the the leader's essential virtues were here compounded in the virtus proper. And so the utmost virtue, mainly excellence, the sum of other Roman virtues. In fact, virtus was actually engraved on the shield itself. Then you had clementia. These were actually, the latter were contained in the virtus, right? But these other were sort of the most important, descending from the one. And remember that virtus there stands for properly a warlike sense of manly excellence. And so the capacity, property of transfiguring holy combat, but as a successful leader. Clementia stands also from the same etymology, actually, of clupes that we said before, and it stands here for to lean to call. And it's actually to do with some sort of idea of clemency, mildness, but intended as, I will simply control you just by my doing. I don't even need to punish you excessively. I will redeem you just through this act of grace. Justitia, from jus, the European, just right. Pietas, to protect, to pay reverence, from the European ped, root. And so piety and duty. And these were truly among the top. The auctoritas, here is a word from aug, to increase, meaning authority, prestige, influence. And so it's all untranslatable, but as a sense of direct control, right? A level of highness that allows you to simply rule from the above. Consider that Romulus as a title for Augustus was discussed because actually the same role of God is historically covered in the archaic Trinity of Rome. In that sense, in all the functions from Romulus, from which everything derived, also Romulus had properly ascended to heaven as God, right? So there could be a possible parallelism. However, the term was dismissed immediately by the Senate since it evoked undesirable associations with monarchy in some sort of institutional sense that at least the Romans were not willing to simply bestow in a categorical sense. That's what they were actually doing there, but it was done in a much more, again, providentially and delicately balanced fashion. Only, in fact, Augustus could control. And we get there of why, right? The monarchy was the regnum, which stands from reg, Proto-European, to rule, to stretch, right? So intended a kingship, a realm. It was something more individual than anything. Augustus acted as a medium of that same divine power that Romulus had represented. In that sense, it was continuous, a monarchic tradition as far as Caesar's kingly inclinations were reminding the Senate and the people. And so Augustus could not be Caesar because it was understood that for how big Augustus could be, that's why Romulus had been discussed. Caesar had also, exactly in order to legitimize Augustus being greater than him, had providentially brought Augustus about, so to say. So they chose the term Augustus, a designation linguistically connected to augo and auctoritas, and suffused with religious overtones as well, right? From haug, to increase or meant, producing August, venerable, right? Sebastos in Greek actually comes from the same etymology. And the ancient poet Ennius, this was an author of the 3rd century BC, was one of the first proper Latin writers in a sort of fully fledged Latin literature at that time was being born, had already referred to Rome's founding as taking place Augusto Augurio. Beautiful terminology. That is an augurium that also comes from augere, from the same Helg root word. So you understand how this was also a game of words, and how we have different terms in our vocabulary that actually stem from the same. There are different terms, but they stem from the same Proto-European root, also in a composite sense. aside from the more primitive phonetic associations. And interestingly enough, this was associated with a bird omen, and so with the eagle as well. And it was like a presagium, a sort of almost prophetical and eschatological and sort of numinous and augural, truly, and sort of promise of prosperity. That's what it really meant. It was so subtle, it perfectly fit Octavian, right? That from thereafter, in fact, would become known as Augustus, a nomen incorporated into the standard imperial titulature that will essentially denote imperial authority as universal ruler ever since for all the Western rulers in history. Now, the name surrounded Octavian Augustus with an atmosphere of sublime dignity and quasi-divine esteem. It was just perfect in the historical time for the person. Etymologically speaking, it did not force on any specific title that had characterized Roman politics before. Obviously, Augustus still bore the name of Caesar, and one of his previous gentilician sort of origin. As you know, Augustus actually shared blood with Caesar, actually, but was not the direct descendant in a patrilineal sense. But the question is, the power of an absolute adoption, right? It's probably the idea of divine power that embraces you, and that is shared also, I don't know, in Christianity, for that matter. Also because if you're truly God, that's essentially what the entire world is related to you with. And it's a term that, in this sense, hints at the mechanism, the metaphysical function of reaching heaven. And naturally, Augustus will, as we'll partially see now, also hold obviously the title, the magistracy of Pontifex. Again, all Roman magistracies had a religious meaning at the end of the day. But it's obvious that Augustus there started performing probably a higher role as patriae as well, just like Caesar had done. Ideally, this was aligned with also Augustus' rank as Divi Filius, because Caesar had already been divinized, Divus being obviously connected with Dave, God, which in part in the European stands also for shining, right? So where you augment through the miracle of transfiguration, you have this aura of holiness, that is to say, properly of divine light emanating from you. So as the Son of the Divine, he carried that, right, in this world, being guided by his Father in heaven. Caesar is still a comet, as you know. And presaging the imperial cult that rapidly developed also, and especially from the eastern provinces, because of their habituation, and their long history of habituation of that area to the deification of sovereigns, between kings, of pharaohs. And again, it was very different from how the Romans intended Augustus. It was actually much more traditionally formal and correct, right? The East had already been sort of exhausting itself historically, falling under these other rulers for that matter, and somehow falling mostly in the superstition rather than an active participation to a citizenry body, like in the case of the Roman martial people under sort of the leaders, the greater imperial war band leaders, imperial and divine auspices, right? Now, some scholars point at inconsistencies lingering in the early setup, at least, and it was surely an in-theory mechanism. Initially, Augustus' authority, for example, differed by province according to inclusion under his proconsular jurisdiction, and his yearly consular colleagues stayed in principle at least his equal, right? It's evident that they could not be equal, so the misunderstanding may derive from the fact that this was just accumulation of offices, of tasks. It was not really understood as descriptive of the entire metaphysical plenitude of Augustus. He was just operating behind an earthly surface, all right, while really managing the world from a dimension that did not pertain to mortals. These discrepancies, however, were important institutionally as well, and they had to adjust themselves also earthly to complete that absolute harmony of the cosmos, so that they were corrected in 23 BC, likely due to issues that arose also while the Prinkaps stayed in Spain, including health problems and political tensions. He gave up the consulship but obtained a lifelong proconsular imperium, maius et infinitum. So maius stands for greater, from me, probably in the European third root of, again, megas, Michael, and so on. Infinitum, meaning properly unlimited, that is to say, imperium sine fine, right? Without limits, understood properly as boundaries in the world, in the physical world, and in the universe as a whole, extending across Rome and Italy as well, right? This is very important because the Romans historically had not conferred an imperium for the city of Rome, because they were essentially just considering themselves as a sole community where power was shared in that republican fashion that they were habituated with. Naturally, this had already been surpassed de facto, but and also like Italy had historically understood that as well. So the Romano-Italic Confederacy, this people that was free in a sense, and it was mostly ruling over other peoples through the provincial imperium that was bestowed with this or that commander that eventually would bring his warriors with him from the peninsula. The fact that Augustus was recognized a proper authority in this sense over Rome and Italy with proper unlimited imperial power was truly exceptional, and it reflected the plenitude and the superhuman character of the figure of Augustus. The Romans had always considered, again, part of their establishment as superhuman, also because that was the difference between the patricians and the plebeians, right? Human coming from humus, and so from the dirt that the plebeians were just earthly bound with, whereas the patricians were those whose ancestors had made it into heaven, basically. But Augustus here were truly augmented above all of this, above all of the same senators that really recognize him as Prinkaps, as a warband leader of the same Roman senators, as a directing leader. By acknowledging his intercessio, that stands for to sit, to go between, meaning veto interposition, the assemblies granted Augustus complete tribunicia potestas, not just obviously sacrosanctitas. That was a way also to properly highlight sort of his untouchability, physical untouchability had been. But here it's a potestas. It's a much more sort of, interpositional, institutional mechanism where much of the senatorial action is de facto controlled by Augustus' will, right? This comes from the tribunes and their potestas, that is a more sort of autonomous term coming from polity, probably in the European, that is lord power, right? Tribunician power, in this case, without any limits of territory or time. This gives you a dimension how much of a monarch the Prinkaps was at this point, but how still this rested on a republican, so to say, even though, again, the term did not exist, facade. In a sense, right, also practice, because, again, Augustus could have not held this power without a very refined and sophisticated control of the entire system through a mind that you can barely comprehend. There are lots of very interesting accounts describing Augustus, his divinity, his eyes, for example, were truly believed to be divine. He had, in this sense, a capacity to stun, to control, right? There are lots of anecdotes, including the one of the druid that wanted to throw him down a cliff, but he turned with sort of his blue eyes, and the druid remained sort of frozen, because it's as if he could see, right, the divine warning him, and not even needing to threaten him or anything, like just the mere presence of the divine to stop him. And the Tribunicia Potestas held such importance that subsequent emperors calculated their reign years based on its yearly formal renewal. Augustus thereby secured the capacity to open Senate sessions by speaking first, thus steering the Senatus Consulta, so the Senate decrees, after the consultation, meaning properly, and there were issues properly of law. Remember, the etymology of Senate has to be for old, but old intended as eternal, as the fathers, as those who were in charge, which had fully developed in a bigger sense, of controlled Rome and her military, to summon and oversee popular assemblies, affecting legislation and magistracial selections, to block unwanted initiatives with veto, to introduce his own bills in the Senate, and to legislate via edicts. Right? These were the mechanisms we were talking about before. Carefully steering clear of any suggestion of royal aspirations, Augustus persistently refused irregular permanent offices like perpetual consulship, dictatura, from dictare to dictator, censura from censor, despite repeated urgings, particularly insistent. In 22 BC, when he opted instead to take on the cura annonae, right? Cura is care. It comes from the Proto-European care, in fact, to make, and annona stands for, as you know, the grain supplies, from annus, year, meaning care of the grain supply that was yearly supplied with the season's harvest. To, in this case, restructure Rome's grain distribution and calm popular dissatisfaction during a food crisis. Rome was ever larger, and the various collegia that controlled the grain supplies were demanding also more. Augustus had to work in order to bring more agricultural resources to the capital. He resolutely declined the title Dominus, that comes from the Proto-European dam, to tame / house. Excuse me, I drink a little. And that, in this sense, recognized to Augustus the same authority of a lord and master in his own home, right? Interestingly enough, the pomerium stems from the imperium of the domus, right? Etymologically speaking. And if you think about what we said before regarding Augustus extending his own unlimited imperium over the same Rome and Italy, you understand that at that point the entirety of the Roman world was considered as his domus, right? That even the pomerium, what marked the sacred city, and they were all different pomeria in a sense. Remember the Rubicon that could not be crossed by legions and so on. Here, Augustus was understood as covering it all, right? Embracing, encompassing the entire mankind. At that point, Rome had conquered the world in any case. In 2 BC, Augustus was willingly accepted himself, actually, the honorific pater patriae, as we said before. So the father of the fatherland, which you may, pater patriae, you have heard it many times, right? But if you consider its etymology, it may sound a bit repetitive, right? In Latin, you don't hear it because it's not your language, but imagine somebody says, you're the father of the fatherland. So not the father of some land, so literally the same father and father repeated with pater, right? And that is the same concept that we expressed before regarding the fact that the Prinkaps was he who got the first, the spolia opima, and for himself it was also the forever imperator that had that function of bringing the spoils to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. You can see there what his proconsular imperium was also about. And only God could be the father of the fathers, right? Because here the patria is understood also in Latin, telling the truth, patria is the land of the fathers, as opposed to the natio, that is the place where you're actually born, right? So there are slightly different concepts, but that's why Augustus' figure acquires a nevermore. This was already a title bestowed to Caesar, right? So ancestral, divine, and absolute meaning, right? Augustus controlled essentially the place from which is a metaphorical, but say metaphysical place, where the same fathers had sprang out from, right? That place between God and man, like where the sacred ruler eternally rises as the king of the living, right? And this is, again, also incredibly important. Here we're skipping naturally many details because this is just like a basic introduction to that. Now, in due course, Augustus joined almost all the priestly colleges, for example. After Lepidus died in 12 BC, again, chapeau to him for having lived also long and, happily dying of natural causes, Augustus assumed the position of Pontifex Maximus. So obviously for pent path, that is the bridge, and dead, as we've seen recently in a video about that root phenomenon in Indo-European theology, means to do, literally. And so the bridge maker, he who bridges, in fact, God with man, or better, man to God. And Maximus is the greatest. For now, as we've seen the root word for great before as well. And so the supreme pontiff, the high priest of Rome. Lepidus had been permitted to keep it up to that point, by the way, for political expediency and to protect the holiness of Rome's principal religious role. It was a way to show that essentially Augustus could afford simply entrust even the highest priestly role to somebody else and still being in charge fully, without anything to fear. As you know, Lepidus had a historically bit of a defiled position, but he had challenged the same Augustus, and so he had to prove now that he had been tamed, like there was nothing that he could do, like he lived tranquil. And this is, I would say, quite beautiful in this historical context. Now, subsequently, in 6 AD, Augustus took charge of policing in the city of Rome, tasks earlier performed by the curule aediles elected by the people, handing them over to a praefectus vigilum. I made a video about the vigiles. I talk a little bit about the defense of the urbs, also with the praetorians. So another video about Augustus you will find in top fix comment down below. Praefectus stands for pride, which means that stands in the front. Right, it's just like praetor, for example, is he who goes, that really marches in front of the others, before the others, right? And the obviously facere, that is to make, and vigilum, genitive plural prefect of the watch, and this was of his personal selection, establishing official police and firefighting services. Looking back at his career within the Res Gestae, a text that reviews, as the full span of his life and accomplishments inscribed in bronze before his mausoleum and copied empire-wide, Augustus was able to assert, quote, "I was superior to all in authority, but I had no power greater than those who were my colleagues in magistracies." Right. So the idea was that his divine power was expressed by the divinity of the Roman people, right? And it obviously has a slight inaccuracy if you at least interpret it as if, and in fact, this is a wrong interpretation, like he was, at the end of the day, not provided with magistracies or titles and functions that were, in fact, different from the ones of his fellow citizens, right? Because this was the expression of the Roman people rather than magistracies per se, but it was understood as a power conferred to. And so the sense, as we often say, as we said also before, that the decisive moral majority of the Roman people was won over by him in order to be the leader, the Prinkaps. But it's important. Mykonos had adeptly directed a righteous propaganda initiative that channeled a large share of the period's literary works, including those of Virgil, Horace, and others, towards celebrating the new order. Fundamentally, the regime operated by centralizing authority in the Prinkaps, or at least concentrating it. He performed magistratorial functions and privileges without assuming the linked magistracies, thereby evading incompatibilities that would otherwise occur, for instance, between the tribunate of the plebs and proconsular military command. And that's why he was truly above, right? Augustus dramatically enlarged the empire through annexations, Egypt, Dalmatia, Pannonia, Noricum, Rhaetia, and expansions in Africa and Hispania, while securing frontiers with client states and treaties, such as Parthia or Kush. He reformed taxation and currency, I have videos on that, built roads with a courier system, created a standing professional army, reduced to about 300,000 soldiers, established the Praetorian Guard, and renovated the urbs extensively, famously claiming to have transformed it from brick to marble. His patronage supported poets like the aforementioned Virgil. He was deified posthumously by the same Senate who had conferred on him such an extraordinary and unprecedented power. The Roman myth, as we've seen with Romulus, of course, greater power was the primogenial bond, with the capacity of Augustus to restore it at this point in history and through his own doing, his own filter, so to say, is truly making the era in which we still live, right? Reminding us the potential of the golden era, inherent even a period of apparent despair, just like the civil wars and the taking over by the side of the Iron Age. It is all restorable. If you're interested in this, again, I really urge you to watch my videos on Roman religion in particular, because that's where you get most of this. Also the playlist on the Augustan era for that matter, that combines in fact the same religious concepts with the practical politics of Augustan Rome, that we are somehow just at the beginning of sort of discussing, as always, for most of our topics. Here I can see that probably we got in the tens, obviously. Yes, this is the 15th video I made about Augustus. And again, it's impossible not to see, not to get there, right? But there is so much of this content. And as I was saying just the other day, there is really a scarce traffic. At this point, it's somehow normal this time of the year to sort of de-escalate from the cold season, but it's sort of strange, because sometimes I make videos that I didn't think they would get me anywhere, and others instead that make lots of views, and it's rare, but others that are just the standard you would want. And I don't honestly, it's very difficult to do with YouTube at any point, but while there was some kind of explanation in the past, that today I don't really understand the trends, right? It seems like YouTube has gone a bit crazy since last year's algorithmic changes, and we will see where this goes. I naturally thank you very much for the support, for those who always watch and share and like and properly act as if they were there. Like, I presume there are people who stand for the like, that support the channel. But if you don't do much, it's difficult to not to care this for me, but say for you, like, why did you subscribe? It's strange, and remember that this kind of content you will not find anywhere else. So we're doing here a very complex thing that it's difficult to explain, admittedly, and to especially like clarify given the circumstances of our world that is also changing crazy a little bit. But after all, this is the point. Here we're offering standards that it's not much you just won't find elsewhere, but that are grounded in a very specific, not simply traditional lens, but it's one of objectivity, of accuracy, right? If you think that there can't be such a thing like somebody thinking to be accurate and objective as also aware of his own bias, like, you probably don't know what history is yourself. And this is what the channel is, the non-obvious. And so when we talk about Augustus, like in this case, always remember the non-obvious, that history is never a linear thing. It's never a single dimension, right? It's not just one nature, one condition will say there's always a beyond. If you don't get that, it's going to be impossible at the end of the day to appreciate anything in the world. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.